I made myself easier to love. The version of me that Nina fell in love with was not me. It was a version I had assembled carefully over the first weeks of knowing her, a version that had fewer sharp edges, softer opinions, a more agreeable relationship with silence. I built it deliberately, though not consciously. That distinction matters, and I want to be precise about it. I did not sit down and decide to become someone else. The process was more gradual and more automatic than that. I observed what she responded to warmly and I produced more of it. I noticed what caused friction and I eliminated it, or softened it, or offered it only in diluted form. Over time, without a single deliberate act of deception, I had become someone significantly easier to love than I actually was. This is not an uncommon pattern. What made it interesting, in retrospect, was that it happened entirely through preemptive adaptation. She never asked me to change. She never expressed dissatisfaction with the parts of me I was suppressing. I made the adjustments in advance, based on projections about what she would prefer, most of which I had no real evidence for. I was solving a problem that had not been presented to me. Over 2 years, certain specific things went underground. Opinions I held strongly that I'd learned, early on, landed awkwardly with her. I stopped raising them. Preferences I had about how I spent time, certain solitary habits, certain ways of engaging with my own thinking, I let them erode rather than defend them. A particular kind of directness in conversation that is simply how I process things, that I had always thought of as part of who I am, I softened it, rounded it, made it less confrontational. None of these were large sacrifices. That was part of the mechanism. Each individual adjustment was small enough to absorb without protest. But the accumulation was significant. At month 8, I was still recognizably me in the mirror. At month 18, I was spending time trying to remember what my actual position was on things I had stopped saying out loud. The relationship felt good in many ways. Nina was not unkind. She was not asking for anything unreasonable. The friction she'd been exposed to, the actual friction, the actual edges, she'd barely encountered. So of course there was less conflict. Of course things ran more smoothly. I had removed the rough surfaces before they could catch on anything. What I had not understood was the price of that smoothness. The price was twofold. The first part I've already described, I lost access to myself. Not completely, not permanently, but enough that I began to notice, around month 20, that I was uncertain in real time about what I actually wanted, what I actually thought, what I would say if I were not filtering first. The filter had become so automatic that it was running even when I was alone, even in my own thoughts. I was editing myself for an audience that wasn't present. The second part was something I had not anticipated. The relationship was built on a false floor. Nina was attached to me, but the me she was attached to was a version of me that required ongoing maintenance to exist. It was not a version I could sustain indefinitely without cost. And more importantly, it was not a version that could continue to be authentic, because it had never been authentic to begin with. At some point, the real me was going to appear, not by choice but by exhaustion, by the cumulative pressure of 2 years of suppression finding a release point. And when it appeared, Nina would encounter someone she hadn't agreed to. Not because I had changed. Because she had never actually met me. The mechanism underneath this is something I've thought about carefully. It is an attachment anxiety response, the belief, operating below the level of conscious reasoning, that being fully known is dangerous. That the real version of you, unmodified, will be found insufficient. That love requires the kind of performance you can only sustain by never being at rest. The preemptive softening is an attempt to solve a problem that may not exist, at the cost of making the relationship into something that cannot hold real weight. Because the weight, eventually, always arrives. The relationship ended. Not dramatically, there was no single confrontation, no catastrophic revelation. It unwound over several months, with a quality of growing distance that neither of us had a clear language for. By the time we named it, the naming felt overdue. Afterward, I had to spend considerable time finding my way back to a position I recognized as my own. Not recovering from the relationship, recovering from 2 years of progressive self-erasure. That process was stranger than the grief. The grief had a familiar shape. The reconstruction was unfamiliar in the specific way of trying to remember something you knew before you learned to forget it. What changed, going forward, was this: I made a practice of noticing the editing in real time. Not to force confrontation, not to be unnecessarily difficult, but to catch the automatic smoothing before it became structural. To ask, when I felt the impulse to round an edge, is this genuine tact, or is this fear? They feel similar. They produce different outcomes. The version of you that someone falls in love with has to be actually you. Not the version of you that has passed through all your projections of what they need. Not the version of you that requires constant maintenance to sustain. If someone falls in love with a managed version of you, you are not in the relationship. A representative is. And representatives cannot be loved. Not really. They can be appreciated, enjoyed, preferred. But love requires access to the actual person, and the actual person, in this story, had been kept carefully out of reach. Here is what I carry forward from this, and what I hope might be useful if you recognize any part of your own story in mine. The pattern I described does not operate because we are careless or unintelligent or unaware. It operates because it has a function, because it is doing something for us that we have not found another way to do. Staying in the wrong situation, staying silent when we should speak, not walking away when the door is right there, all of these behaviors persist because they are solving something, even if imperfectly. They are providing some version of comfort or protection or identity that we have not yet found a better way to provide. Understanding that function is the first move. Not judging the behavior, but asking honestly, what is this doing for me? What would I have to give up if I stopped? What am I afraid will happen if I make the change I know I need to make? Those questions do not dissolve the pattern automatically. But they make it visible in a new way. And visibility changes the relationship to the thing. When you can see what something is doing, you can start to choose whether you want it to keep doing it. The change that followed was not easier because I understood the mechanism. It was the same difficulty. But I went into it knowing what I was moving through rather than being entirely inside it without perspective. That perspective is what I want to pass on here. Not the specific story. The structure. The shape of how we stay in things longer than we should, how we look away from things we can see, how we tell ourselves the thing will change without giving it a mechanism for changing. You are not alone in this. It is not a character flaw. It is how the human nervous system manages uncertainty and fear. But you can do something different. The doing starts with the looking. Look at it. Directly. Honestly. Without the story that makes it easier to carry. And then decide what you want to do with what you see. That decision, fully conscious and fully yours, is the only kind that actually changes anything. There is also something I want to say about the specific moment of turning toward rather than away, the moment when you actually do the thing you have been not doing. Because that moment has a texture that I was not prepared for, and that I think is worth naming so you know what to expect when you reach it. It does not feel like relief. Not at first. The moment of change, of finally having the conversation, or walking away, or saying the thing, or making the decision, often feels worse before it feels better. There is a period of acute discomfort in which the old equilibrium has been disturbed but the new one has not yet settled. You have stopped managing the avoidance, which means the thing you were avoiding is now fully present, no longer softened by distance. That period is real and it is temporary. I want to say both of those things with equal emphasis. It is real, do not be surprised by it, do not mistake it for evidence that you made the wrong choice. And it is temporary, it has a duration, and that duration is almost always shorter than the years of management that preceded it. The other side of that period is different. Not perfect, change does not produce perfection. But different in the specific way of someone who has stopped spending energy on maintaining something and can now spend that energy somewhere else. The ambient cost disappears. The weight that you had normalized as simply the weight of life turns out to have been specific and removable. I have felt that release more than once. Each time it is instructive about how much I had been carrying that I didn't know I was carrying. You probably know what you're carrying. You just haven't decided to put it down yet. When you decide, it will be hard first and better after. That is almost always the order of things. And the better, when it arrives, is real. What I notice now, in the life I have after the story I told here, is a kind of attentiveness I didn't have before. Not anxiety, that's different. Anxiety is looking for the thing that might go wrong. What I have is more like a quiet, ongoing check-in. Am I here because I want to be? Am I saying what I actually think? Am I moving toward what matters or managing around something I haven't named? These questions don't produce constant disruption. Most of the time the answer is, yes, I am where I want to be, saying what I think, moving in the right direction. The check-in confirms what I thought. And that confirmation is itself valuable. It builds a different relationship with my own choices. They feel more like choices and less like things happening to me. On the occasions when the answer is different, when the check-in reveals an avoidance or a suppression or a staying too long, I try to act on the information faster than I used to. Not immediately, not impulsively. But without the elaborate deferral structure. Without the "I'll address this when the conditions are better." The conditions will not be better. They will be different. Different is workable. Better is a fiction. I am the only condition that changes. And I change through the practice of looking and then acting on what I see. That's the whole thing. The looking and the acting. Over and over. For as long as it takes. Which is your whole life. But a whole life spent actually inside it is worth more than a whole life spent at the edge of it, managing the view. I know which one I want. I think you do too.